Hello chaps and chapettes, and welcome to a little look back at some World War II history. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Bob Semple tank, a vehicle designed out of necessity for New Zealand to help defend against the Japanese threat in the Pacific. But did you know America had a similar project, with the similar outcome of, well, let's say it did not work out too well. First of all, we need to talk about John Deere. Born in 1804, Deere was a blacksmith and started his main claim to fame after fleeing his home state of Vermont due to bankruptcy and set up shop in Illinois. Deere made his main money with a self-scouring steel plough. Prior to most ploughs, they were made of wood and or iron and needed to be cleaned and replaced frequently. With the smooth steel plough, it proved to be a success, and soon his company came on leaps and bounds. In 1912, fate would shine on Deere and Company when they moved into the tractor industry, purchasing the Waterloo Gasoline Engine Company in Iowa, and with this bought their very good engines and tractors using a variant of the Model D, which came into existence in 1923. Now we shoot forward to the 1940s. The company now had John Deere's great-grandson, Charles Deere Weeman, in charge, and he could see the writing on the wall. Military equipment was needed. Now, remember that at this stage of history, America did not exactly have some of the best tanks. The M4 was still mainly paper and ideas. The M3 was starting to have bits made for it, and the US mainly had around 450 tanks in major service, which were mostly the M2 light tank, and even worse, the M2 medium tank. Oh boy, needless to say, the United States were not in a great spot for tank warfare. So Deere had an idea, much like a New Zealander named Bob Semple. He had the idea to make an easy-to-produce armoured combat vehicle, cheap, easy to make, lightweight, and effective against enemy foot soldiers. The two vehicles made their debut and were to be tested at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds. The A1 and A2 tank, which were based off the John Deere B model tractor. It had armour plating strapped to it, two 30 caliber Browning machine guns placed into pneumatic sponsons either side of the driver. One of my favourite features is actually the welding goggles used for the gunner to be able to see where they're actually aiming via a pipe. Yes, as you can tell, this is extremely high-tech modern technology of 1940. Pipe and welding goggles. Now, the A1, the first prototype, had a narrow track front axle. This was changed for stability and to allow, well, it to have a turning circle. The three-man crew were protected by a mix of 4mm to 9.5mm steel plate, capable of stopping a 7.62mm round, but not much more. Even a 303 could penetrate that. And actually, it had far less armour effectiveness than the Bob Semple tank, which had around about 8 to 12.7mm of armour, which was capable of stopping a 303. Not much else. In January of 1941, the A1 was tested for its combat roles and use in the US Army. The conclusions were not so great. The narrow front axle, the lack of stability, the lack of visibility, the fact if you fired the guns you would go deft, the cramped conditions, poor stability, slow speeds off-road, and the fact it would constantly get stuck in mud and sand. Now this is rather bad, but it does get worse. The suspension was, well, harder than a Formula 1 car. The driver could not see the road directly in front of them. In live fire testing, the gunners found they could not carry more than a single belt of ammunition in the cramped sponsons, and it said that the gunners were even passing out due to the heat and possible fumes from shooting the guns while the hatches were down. And then you go into the fact that the guns firing up would mean it would very easily accidentally shoot the vehicle's tyres out. Needless to say, the whole review deemed the vehicle inefficient and ineffective, and thus it needed some reworks. Based on the feedback, the A2 version was built, and ready for testing in mid-1941. This version had a lower bonnet, the driver had a raised position, the wheels were widened, but it was a little bit too little too late and the idea was scrapped. There were ideas to use it as a transport and recovery vehicle, but it was decided that a conventional tank would probably do a much better job in the role. And, I mean, you had the M3 Scout cars already, so, you know, we've kind of got better things already. Let's just forget about this one. Sadly, both versions were scrapped, but thanks to some serious enthusiasts, both the A1 and A2 were actually rebuilt and now live on as museum exhibits and go on tour now and again to fairs showing off the strange little John Deere armoured tank. Now, I did start off talking about the legendary Bob Semple, and I feel it does get a little bit too much flack as a bad vehicle. Considering the lack of capability of New Zealand at the time, they didn't really have a tank industry. Fair effort, and at the end of the day, the Bob Semple had some capability to it. It was no worse than an interwar tank. In all honesty, it was closer to the American distant tractor tank. They look very similar. I mean, basically they're the same thing if you look at it. And in a pinch, it would have aided in the defence of the island nation. The John Deere A1 and A2, however, are laughably bad. Bear in mind, these were not ideas from the 1920s. They were being built alongside the M4 Sherman. And America already had the aforementioned M3 Scout car range, which had more speed, armour, and more weapon options. It had a 50 cal on top of it. It had an actual gun that could do something. These armoured cars were laughably bad, and considering they were meant for infantry support vehicles, you have to just wonder how they thought they would be anything more than a waste of supplies and materials. I don't want to be too mean on the people who made these, invented these, and thought they were doing a good job. And if it was made by a smaller nation with a lesser infrastructure, you could pass it off as a failed cursed tank design or armoured vehicle design of the past. But 1940s America, you really should have known better, John Deere. You should have known better. I'm sorry, you just should. And I feel it's time we no longer use the Bob Semple as a bad joke, because at the end of the day, the Bob was not too bad an idea for an armoured pillbox capable of taking out troops. However, an armoured assault tractor by John Deere, well, that was doomed to fail at the start. Thank you so much for watching this video. Let me know what you think of these fantastic vehicles, and if you think they had any tactical value. And if you think you know of any worse tanks, let me know below. I'd love to hear your information, love to know what you think was worse than this. Anyway, keep safe, keep well, and I will see you all again next time. This is me, Carl Screezilla, wishing you all the best. Bye-bye.
As the tanks got closer to completion, Anderson and Milliman learned why the military declared Army A1 and A2 perfectly flawed.
There's a 60-foot blind spot when you're inside this. You can't see. There's 60 feet out there that's blind.
Some of the things that were interesting about it that didn't turn out too well were the fact that the machine guns over here could shoot out the back tires, which is probably not a good idea.